When we receive evidence that goes against what we believe, that creates a negative feeling, a negative, phenomenologically salient, motivational state that we have to assuage somehow. I want to say a little kind of trigger warning about how depressing this talk will be, as opposed to lots of the kind of happier morals we've had from earlier. This is about really deviations from rationality, and because of that, I should dedicate it to Jerry Fodor, a mentor, an old friend, and sometimes tormentor, who would absolutely like the feel of the talk and then disagree with everything I have to say. So, this is a map, which I take it everybody's relatively familiar with, although maybe the orientation's a bit different. You can see, there we are, there's Stockholm at the bottom, and there's the Arctic Ocean. The only thing that I'd like to point out is that the Arctic is frozen. Not really so shocking, but this wasn't always known. There was a time which we had the North Pole uncharted, and that's where our famed armchair geographers come in, and our first real protagonist of the story, Augustus Petermann. He was known as a man with an undeviating affinity for the wrong guess. And there used to be a thing called armchair geography, where you could just map out terrains you'd never been to. He had maps of the Congo. They were very useful for others. And he took it upon himself to map out the North Pole. And he had two pretty big assumptions. The first assumption was that there was a transpolar continent. We know it as Greenland, and we also know that Greenland doesn't actually go over the pole, but that wasn't always known. And the other big hypothesis he had, well, first, just note that if Greenland actually did go over the pole, then you could just make it to Greenland and walk up. But even here, it doesn't go actually over the center of the North Pole, so you can go all the way up on Greenland, and then you'd have to still sail. And so you needed some way of sailing, and to get that, he made these other maps. This is from Silas Bent. And it's a supposed open polar sea. And the idea was that in the summer, the all-day light would melt the pack ice. And there was some evidence for this. There were reports that birds would be seen flying above there. And then there was the idea that there were certain ocean currents, like the Gulf Stream, which was known, and the Kurosiwo, which was then just hypothesized, would be bringing warm currents up, so that if you could somehow just go up those warm currents, then we could have, in the summer, an open polar sea, and the great adventure of being the first to reach the North Pole would be a prize that one could get. So first up, we have HMS Discovery Commander George Strong Nares. He is going to lead his brave crew to the pole, trying to use Petermann's idea. And he leads the HMS Discovery and the HMS Alert. You could see them leaving. The pack ice isn't so bad, and they get it to about there. That's the 83rd parallel, also known as the Nares Strait. And they get stranded there, and Nares comes and reports back. He has very clear reports, and that's that there is pack ice all the way. There is no open polar sea. Okay, well, next up is the Polaris. They get Nares's comments in time, but Petermann still tries to push others to try this pole. They think that Nares isn't telling the right story. And the Polaris goes and meets the same fate. And of course, that's because, as we know, there is no open polar sea. But Petermann was a man who only grew more stubborn in the face of contrary evidence provided by the men who had been to the Arctic. The more people said that there was no open polar sea, the more he was convinced that they had just done something wrong. So now nobody's willing to fund these expeditions, so what he does is what all reasonable people in his position would do, and that's go to the most insane billionaire of their time, the guy who ran the Herald, James Gordon Bennett. And with a nice public-private cooperation between the US Navy and Bennett, they fund the USS Jeannette, who you can see from this picture did really well. They made it up not even as far as Nares Strait and got stuck in the pack ice, and most of them died. There was mutiny. It was a lot of fun. So I want to look at the sort of reasoning that was underwriting what happened with Peterman. The sort of reasoning where the more counter-evidence you get for your belief, the more you seem to strengthen your belief. And there's nothing about Nares that's particularly ancient. I'm sorry, there's nothing about Peterman that's particularly ancient. There's nothing about this story that's just about, people in the early 20th century. We can see it from our own time, from an even more depressing example. Here is, on the left, Obama's inauguration, on the right, Trump's inauguration, and as sadly you may know, Trump keeps saying that his was the largest inauguration crowd ever. With that, let's turn to some perhaps more serious ideas, and that's how Bayesianism is supposed to work. So my goal is going to be to target descriptive Bayesianism, not normative Bayes. Lots of philosophers and formal epistemologists have a lot to say about how the normative Bayes is supposed to work for setting our credences. I'm going to leave that aside for now and just focus on the descriptive claim that we actually update the way that an optimal Bayesian updater should. Here's what I'm skeptical of. It's the algorithmic, not the computational idea. Computational Bayes is, let's just say, beyond the ken of what we'll talk about. Happy in Q&A to go over it. And this isn't to say that there's not lots of tremendously excellent work that's done in this general methodological rubric. There's been real advances in both word learning and development of moral judgment, perceptual averaging, statistical summary representations, causal reasoning, and this list is extremely long, and there are some of the smartest people in cognitive science working on this. None of what I'm going to say is meant to cast aspersions over that work. Instead, what I want to focus on these two separate claims. The first claim is what I'll call imperial Bayesianism, the idea that all mental processing is in some way Bayesian. I think we're going to probably hear a little bit more about that later today. And separate that from the claim of local Bayesianism, that some mental processing, let's say word learning, or some superficial aspects of what you might think of as the mind, sensation, is working in a way that's captured via Bayesian algorithms. Lots of people talk as if the former is what's really at issue, and it's the former that is really revolutionary. I think this is what's underwriting a lot of Jakob's work and Andy Clark's work, although I'll let Jakob speak for himself later. And it's the former that is, I think, difficult to reconcile with some set of findings that I want to discuss today. So I'm not going to argue that there's no Bayesian processes. I'm going to make instead the kind of more tepid claim that the more processes we have that appear to be non-Bayesian, the more we should be skeptical of the widespread Bayesian takeover. And it really is a kind of widespread takeover. Bayesians are doing lots of excellent work, and they're getting lots of the grants to do these works. So I want to take a minute to see how much we can expect it to accomplish. So here are some previously noted issues that I'm not going to talk about in any depth. I'm just going to flag them because I do think that they're real issues. They're just issues that other people have discussed. So there's a question of how the theorem or Bayes' rule is supposed to be represented. Is it merely implicit in computations? Is it built into the architecture? Is it somehow just being approximated by other processes? I take these questions to be problems, not mysteries. Any healthy research program should have these sorts of questions, and there's no reason to cast widespread aspersions just from having these general questions. There's also been more specific criticisms. Andres leveled an overfitting objection, and there's problems of model selection and some variability in decision rules. That's Ernie Davis and Gary Marcus. And of course, we all know about classic heuristics and biases, and somehow the classic heuristics and biases literature, which is meant to show how fundamentally irrational we are, has to be made consistent with the Bayesian takeover, which is, in its true core, a deeply rational view of how humans work. So let's note some starters from perception. It's well known that perception has problems with updating. The Mueller-Lyer is the classic example, so I'll just use a kind of more fun example that has cuter pictures. Here's how chicks raised in controlled environments generally act. So this is an old example. There's some newer data on it, but I was inspired by yesterday's use of examples from the 40s. Hirschberger raised chickens from egghood in cages where they'd only ever experienced light emanating from below, and then they trained them to separate bumps from dents, and then tested them on ambiguous figures, like these two-dimensional representations of craters. And what you see is that the chickens will behave as if the light source was only ever coming from above. That is, that they had a prior about the above light source. And even though all their experience was only giving them light from below, it was swamped by this prior. So here's the kind of crux of the challenge from perception. Maybe it's a prior of the perceptual system that there's only one overhead light source. Nevertheless, we have to explain why this prior never gets updated, even if all of the organism's other experiences runs contrary to this. But there's a lot of moves a Bayesian can make here. They might want to explain away the problem as specific to perception. Maybe perception is modular. Maybe like the Mueller-Lyer, it's just about informational encapsulation, and there's certain information that just doesn't go into our overall updating of credences or beliefs. I think that this is more problematic than that. For one thing, this would cleave off how much of the mind's supposed to be Bayesian. But for another thing, the deep concept behind modularity was different algorithms for different processes, and if this sort of view is right, it's going to be the same algorithm that's working all over, but for some reason it's not being updated. But similar problems are going to arise in cognition. So even if we could solve this, there are issues on the fence. So the idea that all learning is Bayesian is difficult to reconcile what we know about basic learning theoretic findings, some findings about what's not learned. Following up on what Stefano put yesterday, here are some domain-specific constraints on learning coming from kind of the earliest forays into animal behavior. So we know that rats are prepared to associate an audiovisual stimulus with a shock. Prepared means they make this connection very quickly. If you shock them when you show them a light, or you shock them when you show them a sound, they'll make that connection. But they're contra-prepared to associate a shock with a gustatory stimulus, even when they're in perfect contiguity. Give a taste, shock with the taste won't be associated with the shock. Similarly, they're prepared to associate a gustatory stimulus with nausea. You could see this for yourself. If you drank too much last night, you will feel that gustatory stimulus, say your vodka, and associate it with the nausea. But you won't put that towards an audiovisual stimulus, the music you were listening to, or the look of the bottle from which you were drinking your alcohol. And of course, this has nothing to do with rats per se. The same interactions hold in humans. We have certain prepared learning and certain contra-prepared learning, and experience just doesn't seem to swamp those. So the Bayesian has to say something about why we have such a stable pattern of the associations that can be learned, and more importantly, the ones that cannot be learned. But perhaps you can keep the core of Bayesianism and just add some architectural restrictions here and some heavy doses of nativism. There's a nice consilience between Bayesianism and some of the things that you'd find from empiricism, but there's nothing in the letter of the law of Bayesianism that makes it inconsistent with nativism, and some well-known Bayesians do want or are very happy having nativist leanings. Okay, let's move a little bit deeper into a darker territory for the Bayesians, and that's the classic heuristics and biases literature. You might think this is a real stumbling block for Bayesians. The literature is founded on irrationality, but to be fair, it's founded against the backdrop of rationality. Kahneman and Tversky are so well known, not because they found some places in which we're irrational, but they did this against the backdrop of people being pretty good at these sorts of tasks. These tasks, I take it as read, that you know the base rate neglect and the conjunction fallacy and the gambler's fallacy and the law of small numbers and probability matching problems and the waste and selection task errors. And it's just not so straightforward how to interpret these sorts of failures. So let's walk through one case. Let's take base rate neglect. The failures and successes here are just a little bit hard to think through, and figuring out how they're supposed to mesh may lead to some progress. So here's their classic case. A panel of psychologists have interviewed and administered personality tests to 30 engineers and 70 lawyers, all successful in their respective fields. On the basis of this information, thumbnail descriptions of the 30 engineers and 70 lawyers have been written. You'll find on your forms 5 descriptions chosen at random from the 100 available ones. For each description, please indicate your probability that the person described is an engineer on a scale from 0 to 100. Okay, there's a couple ways to then ask the question. First, give your subject no further evidence. Suppose you're given no further information whatsoever about the individual chosen at random. What is the probability that this man is one of the 30 engineers in the sample? When you give the question this way, people do really well. They'll say, well, if there's 30 of them out of 100, then the probability is 30%. But if you just give a little bit extra information, even if that information is really worthless, people's performances start to drop. So here's some worthless evidence. Dick is a 30-year-old man. He is married with no children, a man of high ability and high motivation. He promises to be quite successful in his field. He's well liked by his colleagues. And now you ask what the probability is that he's one of the engineers, and people are going to guess about 50-50. They ignore the base rates, and what they do is they ignore the base rates because they see this information. The information they think is equally likely to go either way. That information presumably swamps what they had previously known, and then they disobey a basic Bayesian rule. Okay, so we know the failures. People ignore base rates. But less well publicized are the successes. Even children as young as 4 years old can be shown to use base rates in very basic ways and bring them into calculations. So Laura Schultz has done this beautiful work showing how children will realize what the base rates are of balls and jars. If you give them a jar that has 5 red and 5 blue balls and a jar that has 7 red and 3 blue balls, the children will be much more sensitive to what's coming out based on what's in there. So we know that people can use base rates, and that use of base rates happens very young. So the question is, are we good at base rates? How do we move forward from this sort of deadlock? One thing that I think would be reasonable for a Bayesian to say is that we have a performance competence problem here. That what you're seeing in the children is the basic competence of our system, that we can all reason as Bayesians, and it just takes really clever setups, the likes of which will win you a Nobel Prize, to show that we'll deviate from them. That the extra information that Kahneman and Tversky provide throw people off and serve as a performance constraint. That's one way to move forward from it. I'd like to suggest a different one. So here's why. At base, Bayesianism's intended as a rational model and oftentimes as an optimally rational model. If you think that Bayesian updating is the way that we should update, and you think that we do update as Bayesians, then it turns out that humans are more or less optimally rational. But there's a lot of problem cases for this that are not going to be able to be licked in the same sort of way. So I'm going to try to focus on these problem cases, not just to make trouble for the Bayesian, but to try to give you a positive view to understand how these problem cases come together. So here's how I see the dialectic. If all we can do is poke holes in places where people don't reason as Bayesians, then the Bayesian position should hold forward, where you have this idea where what's really happening is the basic performance competence distinction that you see in Chomsky happening here too. If, on the other hand, there's something interesting about these errors, if the errors that we make where we deviate from Bayesianism aren't just errors because of processing constraints, but instead are held together in some other law-like way, then there may be some problems for the overall Bayesian takeover. So, in essence, I'm going to argue that Bayesians have trouble with specific types of irrationality, and that this irrationality is predictable. And it's not just predictable, but it's part of our core processing. It's part of how we were selected to deal with certain information. And the more that this is right, the worse the case will be for the imperial Bayesian. Okay, let's start with blocking. I'll go kind of quickly through this since it's come up a few times yesterday. Here's a quick case of backwards blocking where you have two stimuli, let's say a light and a shock that are going with a tone. So the light predicts the shock and the tone predicts the shock, and they're both in perfect contiguity in the first trial. If you then disambiguate by putting the light up with the shock but not introducing the tone, and then test on the tone, what you'll see is the tone gets blocked. You get no conditioned response to it. So this is a traditional problem for basic associative theories, and it looks like it might be a problem for Bayesian theories, but some Bayesian models have been shown to predict this sort of blocking. If you have a better model, one that's looking to predict surprise, then you can see this thing sort of come up. But blocking itself is just one example of a kind of greater phenomenon. It can turn into a phenomenon of what has been termed causal imprinting, and this is a type of belief perseverance. And this is hard for the Bayesian because where hierarchical Bayes nets are best set is in the causal learning case. Bayes nets should be learning causal nets better than causal relations, causal structures better than anything else, but I think that there have been some overlooked problems for it. So I'm going to deal with some evidence from the 80s, from social psychology, and it's very bizarre evidence. It's about people's take on firefighters and risk aversion. So let me just ask everybody here now, do you think you'll be a better firefighter if you're risk averse or if you're risk seeking? So take a second to just think of what would make you a good firefighter, being really risk averse or really risk seeking. Hands up if you think the risk seeking people are going to be best firefighters. Hands up if you think the risk averse ones. And now, is anyone here confident at all? Awesome. You shouldn't be confident because what a stupid question. We have no idea what the relation between risk-seekingness and firefighters are. But it turns out when you ask subjects to do this, they can do exactly what you did. They can generate hypotheses all over the place. And when they generate these hypotheses, they have extremely low confidence, extremely low knowledge base for how this is going. As a side note, this is an amazing human achievement. It's amazing that we can just take these separate properties that have nothing to do with each other and make a hypothesis out of nothing. And you can ask subjects to do something further. You can ask them to make a causal hypothesis, not just which one would lead to a better firefighter, but why. And people can make up reasons, really weird, insane reasons, right off the bat and give you a bunch of them. And now imagine you're one of these people and you've given me your reasons for why risk-seekingness is going to make you a better firefighter. And now I just give you a bunch of information that goes against that. Information's presented as data that's looked at for a long time before this. And what you'll see is subjects will ignore this data. As long as you've created your own causal hypothesis for what the relation is between risk-seekingness or risk aversion and firefighter, there's no amount of data you can give that's going to move people's beliefs. And this happens even when you ask people not to form a belief, but just to form the mere hypothetical of why risk-seekingness might lead to you being a better firefighter or vice versa for risk aversion. And this is a kind of general principle that we have that we can see coming not just from us, but from the animal cognition literature too. Animals are just quicker to learn that a contingency holds than they are to learn that contingency no longer holds. Learning that pushing a button leads to getting food is a much quicker task than learning that the contingency no longer holds, that extinction takes much longer. In other words, learning rates are quicker during belief acquisition, to put it in somewhat tendentious terms, than during belief change. Acquisition's always quicker than extinction, and you might think that in fact this is a kind of general, wide principle. I do in fact think this. I think we've got reasons to think that learning rates, at least in humans, are in fact at ceiling, that we acquire every piece of information given initially as a belief. Here's the kind of model for this that I and Dan Gilbert, a few others, Eric Asp, have argued for. The idea is that the second you token a proposition, you automatically and unconsciously passively accept that proposition, and only afterwards, through an act of actual will and effort and focus, can you reject it. And the idea is that our belief-forming capacities originally grew out of our perceptual capacities, and since our perceptual capacities are by and large veridical, we just act on what was given to us, and that's been the default state for cognition since. And our ability to reject that information is a true human achievement. It's something that we can do, but we can only do with effort. These lines that are the solid lines stand for mandatory connections, and the dotted lines are the optional connections. And that's where cognitive load can come in. So load will disable our ability to either endorse or, more importantly, reject propositions when they're just presented to us. And of course, our modern life is filled with cognitive load, so we should expect that people will have all sorts of really wacky beliefs. And in fact, people have all sorts of really wacky beliefs. So I'm going to take an incredibly depressing little detour from just some statistics that were fun and randomly put together to just counteract a little bit of what the idea behind optimal reasoning in humans should be. So if this sort of ballistic believing picture is right, then the Bayesian has to explain how it's possible that we acquire all these background beliefs regardless of the fit we have with our background view. And that, in part, is to explain how we have all these wacky beliefs in general. It's a problem that all of us have to explain, not just the Bayesian, but the model I gave you is particularly good for it. And here are those sorts of beliefs. So I'm going to pick on Americans because currently we are leading the world in putting out insane beliefs. Over a quarter of Americans believe the sun revolves around the earth. Almost half believes that humans evolved from earlier species, which means that more than half don't believe that. Almost half believe in ghosts, and when disambiguated to explain what ghosts are, they still believe in ghosts. Over a quarter believe in witches, and there's no disambiguation here, but they're supposed to be magical, and that's not that surprising because you can see that they'll also believe in magic. But it's not just about Americans. We shouldn't make this just American-centric. We'll pick on the special relationship we have with the Brits. 43% of Brits believe in ESP, that's extrasensory perception. 10% of them in telekinesis, moving things with your mind. Going back to Americans, about a quarter of them believe they were once a different person in a previous life. For the philosophers focusing on hexaity, I welcome you to reason what they're actually believing when they think this. 72% of Americans believe in miracles, the thing that it's supposedly impossible to believe in. 22% believe that the Bible's the actual word of God, taken to be literally word for word. So one can only conclude that they haven't read the Bible. 63% believe that we found WMDs in Iraq, that the mission was in fact accomplished. 64% believe that Obama was not born in the US. Presumably that's gone up. This is from 2012. 17% of Republicans believe that Obama is a Muslim. Presumably they still do. 7% believe that the moon landing was faked. This is more fun. And now maybe for the most fun, 4% believe that there's shape-shifting reptile ruling class. And this one maybe is the least weird. So of all of these beliefs, it's fun to poke fun at the weird things we believe. I have also insane beliefs too. But these are datums to be explained. When we focus on how unbelievably good our belief-forming faculties are, we might overlook how poor the actual stock of beliefs people have is. I'm going to change gears now and think about what happens when you try to change these beliefs. Because there's nothing more important in our current world than attempting to move the beliefs that seem to be evidence-based, evidenceless, that so many of our fellow citizens have. And I'm going to focus on this phenomenon that's called belief polarization, But in fact, the belief polarization literature has ran together two very, very different phenomena. So I'd like to separate them first. As I see it, there are two routes to polarization. There's the cognitive route and the motivational route. So here's a quote. Belief polarization, this is coming from Kemp's lab, another good Bayesian who does excellent work. Quote, when two people with different prior beliefs observe the same data and subsequently strengthen their beliefs. This is not the effect I want to focus on. This is not the belief disconfirmation effect that I think is so clear. But first, let's look at what this sort of idea is supposed to be. This is what's often talked about. We take, for example, a polarization that's happening through selective weighing or selective exposure of evidence. So say that I give you a magazine that's about car advertisements, and it has a bunch of information about Toyotas and Hondas, and you've just bought a Honda. You're going to selectively look through the evidence, looking for information that's anti-Toyota and pro-Honda, and then you'll end up with an even stronger view in favor of the purchase you made. And this is not surprising, and also relatively well known. So here's the case that most people know, the death penalty case. Take people who are pro-capital punishment and people who are anti-capital punishment. Give them evidence, the same exact evidence, and those who are pro will become even more pro, those who are con will become even more con. And there's some ways of modeling this that can actually be rationally modeled. So you might think that if you have really strong credences in your belief going in, that you should ignore counter evidence and only focus on evidence for it. Or you might think, how some philosophers have argued for this, that it's rational because what's really happening is you have an epistemic requirement to take seriously the evidence that you encounter, but you don't have any epistemic requirements to encounter evidence that goes against your belief. That is a practical issue about how much time you have and what else is happening. I'm not sure how much I buy either of those arguments, but I'm happy to think that they're reasonable enough, and there's room for debate, and there's much worse evidence on the horizon. So let's leave this aside and instead look at the challenge that comes from a kind of old, often overlooked, but beautiful, simple theory, cognitive dissonance. Here's a fun quote. Start with that attribution of it. Cognitive dissonance, the intriguing and controversial notion which has attracted so much attention during the 60s, has fallen on hard times. Having withstood methodological criticisms at mid-decade, dissonance found itself subjected to a more severe theoretical critique by the end of the decade. Bem, that's Daryl Bem of Psi fame, and others suggested that what had been assumed by dissonance theorists to be a rationalizing process in man could be explained by a more parsimonious, rational information processing model. Note what we were just going through. We were going through some models of belief polarization. Then these were models that then Bayesians came and tried to model as actually rational. So we see that the same debate's happening, except this is a quote from Batson in 1975. Like all good debates in cognitive science comes up 30 years ago, and then we have to have the same debate 30 years later. So I'm going to try to pull some of the morals out of it for our current zeitgeist. Again, here's the Jern paper, a quick quote from it. And this is a paper trying to understand polarization from a Bayesian perspective, which, by the way, they should be given tons of credit for. It sounds like a lot of what I'm saying is anti-Bayesian, but I just have so much respect for the people in this research program. They're all doing excellent work, and they're trying to grapple with the problems as they see them. There just might be some bigger problems that haven't been discussed yet. So, a similar result was reported by McCoskey, 95, who asked supporters of the official account of the JFK assassination and supporters of an alternative conspiracy account to read a summary of arguments for each account. Those with strong beliefs diverged, and those with weak prior beliefs did not. The Bayes nets presented in the section cannot account for the fact that only participants in these studies with strong prior beliefs diverged. Note what's happening here. Their model, which has a lot of weird things when you go look under the hood, which I'd be happy to discuss, couldn't account for this seemingly bizarre fact. And it's a fact that if you had really strong beliefs going in, you ended up polarizing. But if you had weak beliefs, this didn't happen. You might want to see this as another performance constraint, but in fact, I think this is some deep insight into the way our minds work, and that a generalized dissonance theory can explain why only the strong polarize. So let's talk about something a tad less depressing, cults. Suppose an individual believes something with his whole heart. Suppose further that he's taken a commitment to this belief and he's taken irrevocable actions because of it. And finally, suppose that he's presented with evidence, unequivocal and undeniable evidence that his belief's wrong. What will happen? The individual will frequently emerge not only unshaken, but even more convinced of the truth of his beliefs than ever before. Indeed, he may even show new fervor for convincing and converting other people to his view. This is, of course, Leon Festinger, and it's from When Prophecy Fails. And When Prophecy Fails was this fun and depressing expose on cults, where Festinger and some of his graduate students went into this millennial cult. The cult said the world was going to end on December 21st, 1956, I believe, maybe 54, and they didn't make a big deal about it. They had some headlines, but their idea was that there was going to be an enormous flood. The flood was going to take over all of the eastern seaboard of America. It's going to flood most of Russia, and they were going to be saved by the sun god Sananda, who was going to come down and just save the people inside the cult. It was a typical millennial cult idea, and like a typical millennial cult, they weren't really advertising so broadly, because what they really wanted was to be saved, not for everybody else to be saved, because that would make them less of the chosen people. So the interesting question is, what will happen after this day comes and goes? And what happened after that, so everybody on that day gets together, and they're waiting with bated breath for signs from Planet Clarion and what's going to happen. And as midnight comes, people are making up new messages about, maybe it's about the medals, that nobody can have any medals, so people are taking all the medals out, and there's no buttons, and people are taking their buttons off. And then, of course, midnight strikes, and everybody's there. And what happens the next day? Well, what happens the next day is that now they go out and start publicizing. They start proselytizing. They try to find other members. They try to get news crews and tell them how this crisis has been averted because of the great works that the people in this small room have accomplished. Now, you might think that this is like one weird look at a cult from 50 years ago, but in fact, in fact, it's quite normal. Here's your newspaper headlines. Prophecy from Planet Clarion, flee that flood, it'll swamp us all. The uprising of the Atlantic bottom will submerge the Atlantic seaboard. This sort of scaremongering technique is not enough to move people beforehand, but afterwards it increases their belief, and it happens in every cult that we've seen studied. So here's a look at 13 different cults. Did they survive the prophecy? Almost everyone survived, and some of these you'll still know. The only one that was looked at, there's only one of these that fell apart afterwards, and some of them have become, quite large and influential. In my own home borough, one of these is still multiplying, and the Hasidic movement is still going quite strong, even though their messianic prophecy seems to have not passed. Now, a reasonable thing to say in response is, okay, well, now we have N of 13, what kind of theory can we make from just a few more cults? Can we get some sort of experimental manipulation of this sort of effect, where after you get disconfirmation of a belief, you raise your credence in that belief? And in fact, there is some evidence for this. So I'm going to walk you through one study of this, but although I'm just walking you through one study, you can get a bunch of other ones that I'm happy to share, or you can see from the corresponding paper. I'm going to look at religion, but there's nothing special about religion here. You can get this working on caffeine for people who think that caffeine's really important, and then you talk about the horrible health effects of caffeine, then they'll raise their credence in the fact that caffeine's healthy. You can get this on the JFK assassination for people who thought that either there was a single shooter or that there was another shooter on the grassy knoll. Give them counter evidence and they'll raise their belief. You can get this for people who are working with nuclear power. If you think nuclear power is unsafe, give them counter evidence. And those with super strong beliefs, after getting the counter evidence, will raise their credence. Let's walk through a fun, depressing version. So this is what I'll call the belief disconfirmation paradigm, and it's the motivational route towards polarization. And the idea is that what's really happening and what's really impossible for the Bayesian to model is a case where you have a belief that P, and you receive evidence that not P, and you accept that evidence is evidence that not P, and then you raise your credence in P. So you might think those earlier cases are cheating a bit, because what were the cults believing? Well, they believed the world was going to end on this certain day, and then the world didn't end on that day, but then they can change their beliefs a little bit. They have some leeway. Maybe they still believe in their overall metaphysics. Maybe they do what some cults have done, which has been, they weren't wrong about the day, but they're wrong about what year it is. Once it becomes the actual year, we're wrong about our calendar. Other cults have said, in fact, no, what's happened is our overall metaphysics was right and our prediction was right, but what was wrong was that there was too much evil in the world and we just didn't account for that. So everyone has a ceteris paribus clause. Can we get a case where you don't have a ceteris paribus clause, where you just have people accepting counter evidence towards the particular proposition and then raising credence in that proposition? And I think you can. So, step one, find some subjects. These subjects came from a Presbyterian church youth group. And then they took an attitude pretest for belief in God. There was a bunch of different questions about how much people believed in God and whether you thought in particular Jesus was the Savior. You'll be surprised to note that agreement here was quite high. Of course, this is a church youth group, so you should expect lots of people believing in God. Step two, here's your manipulation. The subjects are going to read an article that they were told was, quote, written anonymously and denied publication in the New York Times at the request of the World Council of Churches because of the obvious crushing effect it would have on the entire Christian world. It began. It was learned today here in Geneva from a top source in the World Council of Church offices that scholars in Jordan have conclusively proved that major writings in what is today called the New Testament are fraudulent. The evidence consisted of letters apparently written by the New Testament authors bluntly stating, since our great teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, was killed by the Romans, I am sure we were justified in stealing away his body and claiming that he rose from the dead. For although his death clearly proves he was not the Son of God as we had hoped, if we did not claim that he was, both his great teaching and our lives as his disciples would be wasted. Though the head researcher initially suspected the authenticity of these scrolls, he was later quoted as saying, quote, through radiocarbon dating and careful study of the Aramaic dialect used in writing these letters, I have found it impossible to deny that their manuscripts are authentic. You can't imagine what a struggle this has been. I find no alternative but to renounce my former belief that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. I can no longer be a Christian. Step three. Give them a post-manipulation attitude questionnaire about God. Just like the pretest, same questions. You're asked to assess whether you thought the article was true in addition. So just to remind you where we are, you're given a pretest. The pretest is a host of different questions that get averaged together to give you a scaled version of how much you believe in God. Then you're given the manipulation you just saw, and then you're given this test. So, what happens? Well, here's a very unsurprising result. 84% of subjects beforehand believed that Jesus was the Son of God, which should be unsurprising because, again, church youth group. And again, another super unsurprising result. 76 of them did not believe the debunking article. If there's anything we could learn from the current fake news error that we're in. It's that if you just see a piece of information you don't like, you just claim that that information is fake news, and then you get Donald Trump as president. This is itself a predictable dissonance effect, where we just deny things that we don't like, and there's nothing deeply interesting about this, nor deeply troubling for the Bayesian worldview. What's interesting is looking at a few of the other groups. For the attitude change, the non-believers, they increased their non-belief after reading the debunking text. This shouldn't be surprising. If you didn't believe in God beforehand, and you just got some piece of evidence that explains that the Bible is supposed to be based on hokum, then increasing your beliefs, pretty easy. It's the believers who didn't believe in the veracity of the text also. They didn't increase their religious beliefs. Again, not shocking. They assuage their dissonance. Why? Because they think, well, here's some evidence that goes against my belief, but it's not evidence, it's fake news, I don't have to believe it. They don't change their beliefs at all. What's interesting is this last group, the group that were believers beforehand and believed the text, what we'll call the disconfirmation group. For believers who believed the information that was given, when you asked, did you believe what was just presented to you, they end up increasing their beliefs in God across the board. Just think about how weird this setup is. If you didn't believe to begin with, and you accepted this evidence, increasing your non-belief makes sense. If you believe to begin with, and you think you've gotten no evidence at all, not changing your belief makes sense. But if you believe to begin with, and then you agree that you're getting counter evidence that you can't argue against, and then you increase your belief, this is the deeply anti-Bayesian effect. This is the increasing your belief in P after accepting that you've received evidence that not P. How to make sense of this? Here's a tentative principle. The more you self-identify with a belief, the less apt disconfirming information will be to overturn it. Note here, self-identification does not equal having good evidence for, and it also does not equal having a strong belief in. What I have in mind is something like a belief you value. So let's compare. It's often said in epistemology, coming from Quine, or when you're thinking about the web of belief, that in the center of the web is something like your logical and mathematical truths. So that if I told you 2 + 2 = 4, then you think the logical strength of that belief is that's true in all possible worlds. And so now I tell you instead that there are non-standard linear algebras that you can construct where 2 + 2 doesn't always equal 4. Can you believe that? Now just imagine that you're talking to a family member who's a non-academic, and you tell them that Nobel Prize winning mathematicians have figured this, Fields Award winning mathematicians have figured this out. Do you believe it? Most people will shrug their shoulders and say, sure. Compare. Tell one of your family members that award-winning ethicists have been following you around and looking at all of your behavior, and they have figured out that, in fact, you are just such a jerk. You are the world's biggest jerk and are just totally immoral. There's just no amount of evidence. They show you videos of you kicking puppies and stealing umbrellas from homeless people, and you just think, no, that homeless person deserved it and that puppy was going to bite me. There's just no amount of evidence that's going to overturn these beliefs, not for the strength of the beliefs in terms of the logical strength, but instead because we self-identify with being good people, and we don't self-identify with the logical truths. The idea is that the more we self-identify with these beliefs, when we start understanding strength of belief not as betting behavior, but as the things we value, the more that we'll become not just intransigent, but increase our beliefs when we get counter-evidence. So here is a question that always drives everyone nuts, but we have to think, what is cognition for? And of course, there's no single thing cognition's for. It's an old and ill-formed question, and nonetheless, I'll try to give it an answer. An insight from this literature is that cognition has a goal of self-preservation. We adjust our beliefs in part to make ourselves feel good, in part because when we receive counter-evidence, when we receive evidence that goes against what we believe, that creates a negative feeling, a negative, phenomenologically salient, motivational state that we have to assuage somehow. For the beliefs we don't really care about, for the propositions that we're just not very committed on, that feeling's low enough that we can change our minds and that we can be open-minded about it. I think, what is the right thing? Who is going to win the NBA championship? And I don't really care, and you give me some evidence that it's one team and some evidence that it's another team, and we can sit down and have a real productive conversation about it. If instead you tell me, how bad of a person are you? Well, here's some evidence that's just not the sort of thing that we're going to be able to really adjudicate in a rational way. For the beliefs about us being smart, for the beliefs about us being competent, for the beliefs about us being good, we just don't have any of the same rational capacities coming in. And for so many other propositions, when we're arguing about them, what we're not arguing about is that proposition, but it is instead our own competence. A quick anecdote. One of my friends once got into an argument with me about the moon, where I said something about the moon, and he said, which one? And I said, they call it the moon because there's one of them. And he then started digging his heels in and arguing that, in fact, the Earth had two moons. So if you were somebody who cared about astronomy, then surely you wouldn't have this false belief. And there's no way he cared about astronomy. It's only because I made fun of him that his own personal competence was at stake, and now he wasn't going to give up. So what I want to suggest is that belief acquisition and change, these aren't performance constraints. They're in fact a function of a healthy psychological immune system. It's a way of us understanding how we're going to form and change beliefs that are there to minimize pain. And they work similarly to the way that a regular immune system works. And this is an idea that goes from Dan Gilbert through Festinger, probably back through Freud. And the idea is that part of our cognition is there to make us feel better about ourselves so that we can act in the world. And that's not to say that there are not going to be laws of thought that conform to Bayesianism. It's just to say that there's going to be certain other laws of thought that are orthogonal to them that we need to understand if we're going to understand how the mind works. In which case, the sticking point for the imperial Bayesian takeover is how to understand these sorts of laws coming out of the psychological immune system. So Bayesians in some are going to have trouble predicting these effects like polarization, perseverance, and automatic belief acquisition, just because they don't understand this basic concept of how emotion is not just some way of biasing thought, but is a deep part of how cognition is supposed to work in that interaction of motivation and cognition. All right. So explaining this core rationality is the deep challenge that I'm sure will be taken up this afternoon and later. Thanks for listening.